So I wonder, have you ever played foosball? Do you know what foosball is? This game. It's kind of got a table, right? And it's sort of like soccer, but on a table, and has these little paddle guys that kind of vaguely resemble soccer players, and you run and turn the handles and try to get the ball to go into the other person's goal. And kick it down back and forth with these little paddles. And every time you get it in their goal, you score a point, right? And you've got these little tabs on the top, maybe out of wood or plastic, and you slide it across. I scored a point. Well, my wife grew up with this. I'd played it sometimes when I was a kid, and it was something she really enjoyed. And we have a foosball table in our basement that we bought secondhand once, but it's kind of like miniature soccer, and you're keeping track of the points that you score. And one thing that I've been thinking about, and one thing that I've kind of realized, is that a lot of us have one of these little foosball scorekeepers in our minds. I think a lot of us are carrying around a little point slider. And somebody does something to us, they hurt our feelings, or they harm us in some way, and we feel like they score a point on us. And then our desire is to get back at them and to try to get a real zinger in, a real biting word, and score a point on them, right? And sometimes you see this, and sometimes with marital couples, right, where it's like people keeping track, the husband and the wife, of who's got how many points on whom, right? And people are keeping score of who has hurt us and how we've got to get them back. Or sometimes you see it at Thanksgiving dinner, right? Thanksgiving dinner can be really stressful in some families. It's this big event, and everybody shows up, and there may be lots of different political and religious viewpoints around the table, and sometimes it's one of those things that turns into a showdown, right? And last year, somebody got a real zinger on me. They scored a point. So this year, I'm going to try to get a zinger in on them and score a point and have my quick response. Well, Peter, Jesus' friend, Peter comes to him and he asks him a question, and in response, Jesus tells a story. So Peter wants to know, how many times is he required to forgive someone? In other words, how many points, Jesus, do I have to let him score on me before I can get a point on them? How about 7 times? But Jesus has something far deeper in mind than any rule about how many times you have to allow someone to hurt you and how many times you're going to forgive someone. He's aiming at something totally different. Jesus says, no, Peter, it's not 7 times. It's not even 7 times 77 or 77 times. Jesus tells a story to move beyond this whole idea of point scoring, and he points toward the idea of a kind of life that's completely reshaped around forgiveness and around a response to the mercy of the King. And so Jesus desires that we become defined by mercy, become the kind of people who receive God's mercy and who extend God's mercy to others. And none of that can be accomplished by a rule of counting. So 7 times won't cut it, 7 times 70 won't cut it. All of that will be insufficient. We've got to be defined by mercy. And so Jesus tells a story about how this plays out. And I think you probably know this story well, right? The king is calling in his servants to settle accounts. And you can kind of imagine this king on his throne with some kind of an accountant standing beside him with a book or an abacus or something like that. He's keeping track of the debts owed, debts paid. King calls people to account. Come on in and tell me what you've made and what you have lost. Pay up. And this servant comes before him, and he owes the king 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents, which is an enormous sum of money. I think people that would have heard Jesus talking in this day would have heard him speaking about 10,000 talents, and they would have just laughed. Because, 10,000 talents. They would have said, no way. Herod the Great, remember Herod the Great, the king who was ruling when Jesus was born, when he divides up his kingdom into 4 parts, one for each of his sons, he divides up the entire kingdom. And each of those parts makes 900 talents of income a year for the king. So one of those kings, that's a king, would have needed 11 plus years to come up with 10,000 talents. It's this incredible sum, right? And you have to wonder how the man in the parable, the man that the king calls before him, how he could have lost 10,000 talents. I mean, that's a lot of money. I see the servant as kind of this rock star investment guru, and somehow he blows it. And so the king orders a punishment. The man and his wife and children will be sold into slavery. I mean, it's horrible. And they're not going to make much money on the sale of a couple of slaves, certainly not 10,000 talents worth. I mean, this is more about setting an example. It's punishment. But the servant in verse 26 says, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." And so here's this impossible debt, a debt that must have taken years to incur, a debt that is completely outlandish in its proportions, a giant, kingly, impossible debt. And the man asks the king to be patient with this impossible debt, and the king says, "Okay." Verse 27, the king says, it says, "The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go." Okay. You're free and clear. And this man must have been living large on that kind of money that he was imagining. He's throwing around kingly sums. He must have even felt like a king himself until that debt came due and he didn't have the cash. And he walks out free and clear, no money, no credit, no problem. The master has mercy on him. But this man goes out into the street and he bumps into another servant who owes him some money. 100 denarii or denarii. And one denarius was the usual day's wage for a laborer, kind of at the bottom end of the scale. Just a day laborer gets 1 denarius a day. This man owes the other servant 100 denarii. And so, it would take a couple months to pay it off, but at least it's a manageable debt. You could imagine paying it off little by little. And the scene should sound a little bit familiar because the second servant says, "Be patient with me and I will pay you back." And so here's the man who has been forgiven a huge debt, who now has the chance to forgive a small debt, pay it forward, let it ride. And instead of returning the mercy that he received, the man has the other servant thrown into debtor's prison. Of course, word makes it back to the king, and the king does not take this lightly. He calls in that first servant, and he calls him onto the carpet. In verse 33, he says, "Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" Then he throws this man into jail until he can pay the debt, but this time he will be tortured. It's really horrible again. The first time seems generous in comparison. And Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like this. And we have to keep in mind, whenever we're hearing one of Jesus' parables, that a lot of times he intentionally exaggerates bits of them. So it's not that God is a king who tortures his servants. It's not that torture is okay. But what Jesus is saying is that here we are, people who have been forgiven an enormous debt by the king. The slate's been wiped clean. We have the opportunity to begin again, to be defined by mercy rather than debt and live a new kind of life. Here we are, we're all that first servant. And if we ask the king to forgive us, he does. And so Jesus is saying, so what are you going to do with that blank slate? How are you going to live out that forgiveness? What then? And the key to this parable is mercy. Are we defined by mercy? Or are we defined by the ledgers of all that others have done for us? I mean, are we defined by scorekeeping, or are we defined by mercy? And remember that Jesus tells this story to Peter when Peter's asking about forgiveness. How much forgiveness do we have to extend? And look, forgiveness is a very dangerous topic. I tread very lightly when I talk about forgiveness. Because, forgiveness is a difficult and a sacred thing. You can't just tell someone to forgive. Forgiveness has to come, like Jesus says in verse 35, from the heart. It's easy to talk about forgiveness in the abstract. It's easy to say that we need to be the kind of people who forgive. It's easy to recite that old bromide that to err is human, but to forgive is divine. I mean, that's all pretty easy. Until we're actually in the position of having to forgive someone. You see, forgiveness is all well and good until somebody gets hurt. When someone hurts us or hurts someone we love, we get angry. We get scared. We get into a fight or flight mentality. Most of us are not able to enter into a forgiveness state of mind at that point. When something that matters to us is on the line, that it's hard to talk about forgiveness. Sometimes it can even be a small thing. A couple of years ago, there was a lawyer in Massachusetts who had this consulting business for a large news organization. And this lawyer in his consulting business made $800 an hour to do this consulting, which you can do quite a lot with $800 an hour. And he ordered some Chinese takeout. And when he paid the bill for his Chinese takeout, right, he's at his desk making $800 an hour. When he paid the bill for his Chinese takeout, this is a true story, he realized that he had been charged $4 over what he was supposed to be charged. And so he calls up the restaurant. He's like, you told me it was $30 or whatever, but it was $34. What's up with that? And the restaurant said, sorry, the price has changed. We guess we didn't update our website, and we'll pay you back $4. But the lawyer doesn't drop it at that. He's so annoyed. He says, I want you to pay me back 3 times the amount, because that is what is allowed by Massachusetts law. So I want you to pay back 3 times $4. I want $12. Right? The guy earns $800 an hour. And so they start this email exchange, right? Because he's like, I want to speak to the manager. And they've got this email exchange. He's like, I have already reported this to the applicable authorities. So the restaurant's like, okay, we'll pay you $12. But at some point, the restaurant owner says, is this really worth your time? And then maybe in secret revenge, he released the email exchange to some news outlets, and that's how word kind of got out everywhere. You wonder if this lawyer ever dared to order takeout from them again. To his credit, he in the end said, okay, maybe I went a little overboard. But $4 overcharge on Chinese food and creating this big scandal, we can all see that that's a little bit ridiculous. We can all see how silly that whole thing looks from the outside. But that's sort of the point. Forgiveness is easy to talk about when it's somebody else's thing, but it's harder to practice when someone does something to us or to someone that we love. That's when the rubber hits the road. And, sure, we ought to be people of forgiveness, right? But when someone has actually hurt us in a way that matters, that really touches a nerve, then we find it's not so easy to talk about forgiveness. I think for some people, at some points in their life, forgiveness is a 4-letter word, and we have to be patient with people. We have to give them the space to come to forgiveness on their own timing. We can never force forgiveness from the outside. And there's a reason our brains are fundamentally wired to keep score, just like that foosball game. We keep score because it has to do with a sense of justice, a sense of fair play. And mercy, in the way that we see it playing out in the scriptures and in Jesus' teaching, I don't think it undermines justice. But I think what mercy does is point us beyond scorekeeping towards forgiveness. And forgiveness is deathly hard. To really enter into the work of forgiveness is to enter into the work of grief. Grief for what has been lost. Grief for what might have been. Grief for our hopes and dreams and relationship. There is no true forgiveness without profound grief. To forgive is to let things break. To watch things break. To be the broken thing. And that's hard. Sometimes people can be in a place where that is impossible for them. We can be in that impossible place. And we just have to be patient and walk with people and ourselves on that road to forgiveness and allow ourselves to come to forgiveness on our own timing. And I think Jesus understands all that. I'm convinced that Jesus understood human nature in a way that surpasses our understanding, and that what he teaches is exquisitely practical. I think Jesus understands that there is a timeline for forgiveness, understands what it takes to get to forgiveness. I think that's part of why in this chapter Jesus teaches this multi-step process for dealing with conflict and redressing harms that are done. So I don't think Jesus is being flip when he tells Peter that we have to forgive 77 times or that we have to learn to forgive from the heart. Forgiveness is hard. And I think Jesus is aware of that fact, just as Peter is aware of that fact. That's why Peter brought up the question, forgiveness is hard. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is that forgiving someone doesn't necessarily mean coming back to a clean slate with them. We can never really forget when someone has harmed us deeply. The relationship never really resets. We might not have the same trust for them. We might not be able to be around them anymore because of our physical safety or our emotional safety. But what we can do is change the way that we look at that relationship, how we look at that person, look at ourselves, so that we are no longer defined by the counting of slights received and points scored. We start to operate on a different system, the mercy system. What Jesus is getting at is that we are people who have been forgiven, and so we are called to forgive others. God has shown us this tremendous, huge, incalculable mercy, and we're called to show that kind of mercy to others. We're called to be defined not by the debts others owe us and the wrongs others have done to us, but by the mercy that we have experienced from God. This is the thing. When we're wounded by someone, there are ways in which that wound can come to define us. And we get bound up in our scorekeeping. I mean, we're both at the table. Neither of us can leave because we're both invested in that final score. Who's going to win? Who's going to come out on top? And I mean, just think about stories that we tell. And the way that we'll repeat over and over again the time that someone did something to us, or the time that someone said something really bad to us, or the time that someone, man, they really hurt my feelings. What a jerk. And I mean, if you're south of the Mason-Dixon line, well, you can tell these kinds of stories, and it's okay if you just add, bless his heart at the end, right? What a jerk, bless his heart, right? It's all good if you say that. You know, he said some kind of stupid the other day, bless his heart. And we do this all the time, right? I mean, we kind of remember and we recite what people have done to us, those things that have come to define us, and we become this person that's wounded by, fill in the blank, so-and-so, such and such. We come to define ourselves by that hurt. And what Jesus desires is that we become people not defined by the hurts and slights and wrongs, but by mercy. Jesus desires that we receive God's mercy and extend God's mercy to others. And this is hard for us. We are not always the most merciful people. We are not always the best forgivers. Bless our hearts. But you know, Jesus' desire is for us to move beyond counting off the wrongs and calculating forgiveness to become merciful people defined by mercy. We stop trying to keep score and we start trying to live in mercy. And I think becoming defined by mercy starts with experiencing God's mercy. He's the king in this story. We're the servants that come before him, and we can't repay the debt. We don't have the cash. We've squandered what we've been given. Our pockets are bare. We're empty-handed, folks. But when we ask for that king's mercy, he grants it. And this is where it all begins. So do we sense ourselves to be people who have been forgiven an impossible debt? Do we sense that we are those who have received mercy? Do we live with gratitude for what God has done for us? Have you ever felt that? That kind of gratitude for God's deep mercy? Have you felt that? I mean, I have. There are times when I just feel blown away by all that God has done for me, by the mercy that God has shown me. And it's not just that God's been so good. I mean, he has. It's that I recognize somewhere down in the pit of my stomach that I do not deserve any of it. That God's kindness to me goes above and beyond anything that I'm worthy of. I recognize myself in Jesus' words to the church in Laodicea. I'm that spiritually wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked person. Bless my heart. And so much of my life of prayer, my sense of mission and calling flows from this realization that I am not worthy of all that God has done. Have you ever felt that? In Jesus' story, we're the guy on the street. We're the guy who had this impossible debt canceled, and the question becomes, now what? Because you see, after we've experienced mercy, then we've got to go live in mercy. The two are related. We receive mercy, we live in mercy, and this is why Jesus said in another place, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. This is why Jesus said, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. And most of us are naturally inclined to turn around like this guy in the parable and demand the debt, the slight, the wound against us be paid. We've received incalculable mercy from God. Can we learn to live that mercy out? You know, it may be that the greatest work of the church in our day and age is mercy. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of hurt out there. And I think as the church, we want to strive to show the face of God's mercy to the world, to be people who live by mercy. I think there's a tremendous hunger for mercy. I think there's a desire to show mercy and to receive mercy. Sometimes that mercy that is out there might come from surprising places. You know, we've been in this season of hurricanes, and people are volunteering, raising money, looking for ways to help out folks impacted by hurricanes, especially in Texas and Florida, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, some of these places that have been hit by hurricanes. And in the days after Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, there was this tremendous outpouring of support. And in fact, we're going to be gathering money for our White Christmas project through Mennonite Disaster Service to help with hurricane relief. But some of that support came from some surprising places. And one of them was the Texas prison system. So Hurricane Harvey hits, and people are opening up their wallets to help out or going and volunteering. And people incarcerated in the Texas prison system also wanted to help. And even though most of the inmates have only a very small amount of money in their commissary accounts, right, these accounts where they can buy things like a little extra food or whatever, even though they have usually just a very small amount of money in there, prisoners across Texas ended up donating almost $54,000 to hurricane relief. And what's interesting is that this wasn't the first time that prisoners in Texas have done that. Something similar happened years ago during Hurricane Katrina when it hit New Orleans. You know, these are people in prison. They're supposed to be what our society calls the bad people. And at least they're people who have got themselves into trouble, maybe done something bad. But there they are. They want to show mercy too. They want to show mercy to people who have been impacted by this hurricane. You know, I think there's a fundamental desire to show mercy and to be shown mercy. And that might be the stamp of God's character on the human heart. And I'm convinced that one of the most basic marks of discipleship is going to be growth in mercy. We start to take on the merciful character of Christ. How do we get there? How do we become people of mercy? Well, it starts with being in relationship with the King of mercy. When we've had this deep sense of an experience of God forgiving us, then we're going to be more apt to respond to people and life with gratitude and mercy than with counting. It's the kind of encounter with God that really requires us to be people of prayer. You know, you cannot pray with any kind of seriousness and not start to have a sense of your smallness and God's bigness. You can't pray without starting to realize how much mercy God has shown you and how much you really owe God. I mean, I think that's like the starting point of prayer. Same goes for the Lord's table. Every time we approach his table and break bread and share the cup, we start to realize how indebted we are to his tremendous mercy. But I also think that learning to show mercy happens by practice. We have to strengthen our mercy muscles, and every time we use them, they get a little bit stronger, right? We show mercy, and then we begin to become more merciful people. It's just the everyday stuff, not jumping on the mechanic when your car's not done, or learning to befriend your spouse's weaknesses, or recognizing the brokenness in people and learning to be patient with that. It's these everyday mercies that matter so much. And unfortunately, it's the everyday mercies that can seem kind of thin on the ground among so many Christians in the wider church, not least in the church's, in many quarters, hesitant care for refugees or our impatience with immigrants who entered this country illegally. You know, sometimes when I read how Christians respond on Facebook or in the media, I wonder if they believe in mercy at all. Do we believe in mercy? You know, that might be the starting point. Maybe maybe this is what it all comes down to. Do we believe in mercy? Like, do we actually believe in God's mercy, that we have received it? and that it's something we're called to extend to others. Do we believe mercy? I pray for all of us, not least myself, that we can come to be people defined by mercy. I pray that we can sense Jesus' words are true, that we can move away from our tendencies to count and keep score, and begin to live into the words of Scripture. God saved us not because of any works of righteousness that we had done, but according to his mercy. Amen.